Hello and welcome to Eastern Roman History, the best source on the internet for the history of the Eastern Roman Empire. All of our information is based on primary sources and scholarship from leading historians. I'm your host, Daniel Maynard. This is the second part of the top 10 emperors list. If you have not already done so, watch the first part. Before we begin, I would like to give an honourable mention to Michael VIII, Alexius I, Theodosius the Great, Leo the Great, Constantine V, and Basil I as being exceptional emperors which could not quite make it onto this list. Now, let us begin. Number 5. The man that saved the empire from total destruction by the Sassanids, Heraclius, stands as one of the greatest emperors for his tireless campaigns against the Avars and Persians. He managed to keep his empire together for much of his reign, and was willing to innovate when it was needed to survive. The adoption of Greek as the official state language was perhaps the end of a process started by Leo I, but it was another of the fundamental changes to Roman society that distinguishes it from its ancient past. Heraclius's daring campaign against the Persians and victory at Nineveh, as well as restoring the true cross to Jerusalem, can only be described as legendary, especially considering he had almost no military experience prior. He then demobilized the massive army he had assembled to start rebuilding the empire. He cannot be criticized for this, as there was no way of knowing that the Muslim Arabs would begin their own conquest, since they were hitherto an insignificant power. He repaid the massive sums he had borrowed from the church. He economized where possible, and this involved putting off dealing with the Slavic occupation of the Balkans, which for now was not an immediate problem. He allied with the Bulgars in keeping the Avars at bay. Heraclius spent several years in Syria and Egypt to oversee their reintegration into the empire, having been occupied by the Sassanid Persians. He attempted to heal the Monophysite and Chalcedonian schism by introducing monergism, a combination of the two doctrines. He was endorsed by the patriarchs of Constantinople, Alexandria, and Constantinople, as well as the separate Armenian Coptic Church. For the moment, the church schism was healed. He eventually garnered good relations with the Persian King of Kings, Dagur the Third, after their own civil war. Starting from 633, it all went downhill, with the first incursions by the armies of Islam. Defeat followed defeat, and eventually Heraclius had to abandon the Levant after the Battle of Yarmouk. This was a strategic decision to try and strengthen the armies in Egypt and Anatolia, rather than waste more resources trying to hold Syria and Palestine. Monergism also failed as strong opposition occurred against it in both Monophysite and Chalcedonian populations. He then abandoned monergism and introduced monothelitism, which was equally unsuccessful. It changed the idea of Christ having two natures but one energy, which was monergism, into having him have one will, which was monothelitism. It is often said that he was the emperor that lived too long. Starting as a young man and championing over the greatest threat to Constantinople since Attila the Hun and the Goths, Heraclius, as an older man, increasingly failed to contain the Arabs, holding them for now in Egypt and northern Syria. To compile the difficulties cropping up in Heraclius's later life, the Black Death broke out again during this time. By the end, he was constantly ill and incapable of dealing with the Arabs as he had done with the Persians. He also famously suffered from hydrophobia. His religious policies in the end only caused more problems. His marriage to Martina, not only immoral, but was also a detriment to the empire. After Constantine the Third, Heraclius' son, died of tuberculosis, Martina became regent of Heraclius. She was deposed by Valentine, head of the Eastern Army, who had her tongue slit and Heraclitus' nose cut off, putting the young son of Constantine the Third, Constans II, on the throne. The empire could ill afford civil strife during the Arab invasion. Much of Heraclius' later failures was solved by Constans II and Constantine IV, both of whom could easily find their way onto this list. However, taken altogether, Heraclius stands out as being an exceptional emperor. Number 4. The son of the genius Alexius I Comnenus, John II Comnenus, pits his father to the post as being in the top positions on this list because of his almost flawless record as emperor and the continuation of many of the good policies of his father and expanding upon them. His 25-year reign saw the almost total elimination of the Sultanate of Rum from Anatolia. Had he not died when he did, it is very possible that he would have succeeded. This was also a huge departure from Alexius's war strategy, from being almost entirely defensive to steady expansion. John, as a result, spent most of his reign in a tent, conducting his numerous campaigns and sieging back all of the cities that had been lost since the reign of Michael VII Ducas. Not only having to deal with a conspiracy by his sister Anna Comnene, he abandoned his father's policy of only appointing people related to the imperial family and switched to only appointing people based on merit. He annihilated the Pechenegs at the Battle of Borea, and they never again threatened the empire. He successfully managed to prevent Hungary from expanding any further into the Danube, and Serbia remained under the Roman sphere of influence. The only true failure during his reign was his unsuccessful bid to rescind the trade treaty the Romans had with the Venetians. This was established by Alexius I and gave the Venetians a much reduced trade tariff compared to their competitors. This made Venice the dominant trading power in the region. John was unsuccessful in decisively defeating the Danish men Turks, but this did keep them on the defensive. John conquered Cilicia from the Armenians and vassalized the Principality of Antioch. His alliance with the German emperor kept the Normans of Sicily in check. Despite all of his efforts, with seemingly not much to show for it, John's reign was one of competent rule, ever-advancing frontiers, broad diplomatic success, and a long reign of nothing but prosperity. The only tragedy of his reign was that his conquests were not more significant, and that so little detail of his reign survives compared to his father or son. Number 3. The next 3 emperors would likely appear on any top emperors list, in some order or another. It was the reign of Justinian the Great that saw the recovery of the western provinces. Vast building projects that resembled the elder days of Rome, and a strong and competent governance of the empire. Called by Gibbon as the Roman Cyrus, and for good reason, he used the stable and rich state built by Anastasius I and Justin I to effect the reconquest of the core regions of the Western Empire. Belisarius conquered Africa and finally defeated the Vandal menace which had dogged the efforts of the emperors Majorian, Anthemius, and Leo the Great. After an extensive war, Justinian's forces conquered the Ostrogoths of Italy and Dalmatia, restoring much of the Danube frontiers, and, of course, Rome. With the addition of the Western Islands and southern Spain, Justinian had conquered most of the western provinces, or at least made future conquest possible. Most of these conquests were permanent. Rome would remain a Roman possession until the papacy gained independence in AD 800. Africa would stay Roman until its conquest in 698 during the reign of Leontius. Southern Spain was largely lost during the reign of Heraclius, and finally conquered when the Muslims invaded Spain. Italy would have a Roman presence on it until 1071 with the fall of Bari. Dalmatia would be lost to the Avars and Slavs, but Roman authority was restored in the reigns of Basil II and Manuel Comnenus. His codification of all Roman law in the Digest stands as one of the greatest feats of his reign, for its long-lasting and foundationary place in history. His other law book, the Institutes, was created to teach lawyers in law, and many of his buildings, such as the Hagia Sophia and Monastery of St. Catherine in Sinai, still survive to this day. Justinian, after gaining encouragement from his wife Theodora, suppressed the Nikou revolt, a serious revolt that ended up with a fire in Rome destroying much of the city. He unsuccessfully tried to deal with the schism between Chalcedonians, Monophysites and Miaphysites. Justinian himself, starting as a Chalcedonian, eventually fell to heresy which blackened his name in later years. He had no children, which was not a disaster but certainly made the succession uncertain. The brutal measures Justin II used against his cousin Justin could be seen as a need to remove any threat to the stability of the empire, put in doubt by Justinian's lack of a clear heir. The Black Death appeared for the first time during Justinian's reign, which devastated the population of the empire, leaving it undermanned when a fresh set of enemies appeared towards the end of his reign. Some also criticise him for closing the school of Athens and his crackdown on the last remaining pagans in the empire. However, this should be taken as the end of a process that had started since Constantine the Great 2 centuries earlier in fully Christianizing the Roman Empire. However, despite these failings, they pale in comparison to the many successes of his long reign, one so impactful that the entire period from Justin I to Justinian the Great's death is known as the Age of Justinian. Number 2. Basil II the Bulgar-Slayer, perhaps the greatest soldier emperor, was a brilliant emperor, who, if one were to calculate his reign from his coronation, ruled for a staggering 65 years. Even counting from when he became full emperor at the age of 18, it is still a staggeringly long reign, even beating the longest reigns such as Theodosius II. The empire saw the recapture of much of the territory that had been lost to the Arabs centuries beforehand, during the reigns of his 2 predecessors, Nicephorus II and John I. Starting off with the rebellion of Bardus Skleros and Bardus Phocas, this event was a watershed in the sheltered and pleasure-filled life of Basil. After the eventual defeat of Phocas and Skleros, Basil truly matured and took his role of emperor seriously. Out of his numerous and vast conquests, the greatest of these is undoubtedly the total annexation of the First Bulgarian Empire, an entity that had managed to remain independent from the Romans since their first arrival in the Balkans in the reign of Constantine IV. He vassalized Fatimid-held Tripoli briefly and protected the Emirate of Aleppo, maintaining it as a vassal from annexation by the Fatimids of Egypt. He made Croatia and Serbia client kingdoms of the Romans, extending Byzantine authority over the entirety of the Balkans. Basil forced the king of Georgia to submit to his rule. King Sambat John of Ani agreed to make Basil his heir. The Armenian king of Aspurakan, Sennacherib, gave Basil his territory to protect it from raids, seeing the writing on the wall. With this, he had essentially become the master of all the Christian princes of the Caucasus. He extended his hold over much of southern Italy and secured the southern coast of the Crimea. As a commander, he was no military genius. unlike his two predecessors, but he was consistent at always maintaining a cautious and well-organised campaign which saw him defeat every enemy he came across. This, perhaps in itself, is a stroke of brilliance that Basil was able to so consistently defeat his enemies. He introduced a new land law along the lines of the one that Romanus Lecapenus and Constantine the Seventh Porphyrogenitos had created. All land that had been bought from small landholders by the Dinotoi, or since the 927 famine, was to be returned to its former owners. These holdings could now be reclaimed at any time without compensation and had no time limit. He also removed many of the tax exemptions that had been starving the imperial treasury of money. He founded the Varangian Guard when he married his sister Anna to the Grand Duke Vladimir the Great of the Kievan Rus, Christianizing the Rus and getting considerable forces to defeat the two Barduses. He established many new themes out of the lands he conquered. He left the treasury with a surplus of 14.4 million numismata by the end of his reign. Perhaps Basil's greatest failure was his lack of succession plans. His brother, Constantine, had 3 daughters, but except for Zoe's brief betrothal to Otto the Third, none of them were married or produced children. By the time Basil died, they were all beyond childbearing age, despite Zoe's initial efforts to bear children. Basil had no children and never married. After the Skleros and Phocas revolt, he seems to have entirely devoted himself to what was in front of him rather than making plans for the future. Number 1. Constantine the Great. It might seem like a cop-out, and there are certainly arguments for why he is not the greatest Eastern Roman Emperor, and definitely others could be number 1. However, there are few men from the ancient past that have reverberated so much in both medieval and modern history from the imperial period. Not only this, but he was a very successful general, hardly losing a single battle. He established Christian orthodoxy with the Council of Nicaea, reformed the currency that lasted 700 years. He built Constantinople and constructed many new buildings, such as St. Peter's in Rome. He disbanded the Praetorian Guard and replaced them with a new imperial guard. His reforms are not beyond criticism, and in many ways Diocletian was far more the architect of the Dominate than Constantine. Constantine bloated the administration and may have weakened the frontiers to secure his own position in the empire. His succession proved successful, but Constantine II and Constans I came to blows, and the dynasty did not last beyond the next generation. His apparently arbitrary execution of his son Crispus and wife Fausta have no explanation, and show him up as being increasingly paranoid and despotic in his later years. However, his broad and largely successful reforms and campaigns were some of the most successful in the empire's history. It is Constantine the Great's adoption of Christianity, the construction of Constantinople as a new imperial capital, and his completion of the reforms of Diocletian that saw the empire start to develop from being the Roman Empire of classical antiquity and start to become the Eastern Roman Empire of late and medieval period. It is for these reasons that Constantine I is often seen as the first Byzantine emperor, rather than later emperors such as Theodosius or Heraclius. His memory was so resounding that he is still remembered today and is perhaps one of the most well-known emperors of late antiquity. That concludes my top 10 Eastern Roman emperors. Whether you agree with me or not, leave a comment, subscribe, like, and share this video with others. I would love to hear what top 10 Eastern Roman emperors you would come up with, and see how they compare with mine. I hope you enjoyed this top 10, and we'll see you next time.